language used in European social policy incorporates many of the defining terms of the independent living movement: independent living, self-determination, personal assistance, etc. However, their policies continue to be assistive and obsolete. Do you agree with that assessment? How is it possible to reconcile concepts such as self-determination in laws that call for institutionalization?
Well, you can't have both. So if independent living is really going to be the strongest voice, then it has to be very involved on issues around not developing institutions and closing institutions. In the United States, there's a very strong organization called ADAPT. Many of the people in ADAPT come from the independent living centers, and they are very forceful in working on fighting against institutions. We also have been working with the movement for people with intellectual disabilities and psychiatric disabilities, fighting against institutions, and the elderly. In the U.S., we had a very important lawsuit a number of years ago called the Olmstead decision, and the Olmstead decision stated that if you could provide the same services in the community for the same amount of money or less, then you should be able to live in the community. In countries where institutions are a very strong part of the history, it's not going to change overnight, but I think making effective arguments, organizing with people, getting the people who live in the institutions to want to live in the community, those are all things that I think are very important. And I believe I believe that we need to lead by example. So when people see us able to live more independently in the community, other people, I believe, are interested in doing the same.
The use of the terminology of independent living and its ignorance when it comes to policies is not just the case with many EU governments, including Spain, but also with the so-called traditional movement of disability. Why do you think it is so difficult for institutions that defend disabled people's rights to integrate the IL, the independent living philosophy, and not just its vocabulary?
We've been talking over the last couple of hours about the financial support that some organizations get in Spain, and so maybe there's a financial issue. People earn their living through these organizations. But in most other countries, that's not the situation. I would say that one of the big issues on getting people to change is really for people to be able to see that they can benefit from the change. I believe that if people are getting certain supports, and they have them now, and if they're afraid of losing those supports, they may not be willing to fight the same way. But in many other countries, people haven't had anything. So they're fighting not just to get the services or to change the policies, but to have them done in a certain way.
Do you think the United Nations Convention assumes the independent living philosophy?
Definitely. I mean, I think, would it say it assumes the independent living philosophy? I don't know, because independent living as a philosophy is still a new and emerging philosophy, using those words. But I would say that the convention was heavily influenced by disabled people, and the disabled people that influenced the convention all are people that are fighting for the rights of disabled people, for choice, for people to be able to become integrated into the community. And if you look at the convention and you look at Article 32, Article 32 I think is very important because it speaks about the need for inclusive development.
You're aware that one of the most controversial issues, and one which generated more rejection during the creation of the convention, was making an explicit reference to women, to disabled women. How do you explain this opposition?
I think they were saying they didn't want to distinguish groups. They didn't want to distinguish women from men, etc. But in the end, the women were very powerful and very successful and were able to do that. So I think, again, it spoke to the influence of the voices of disabled people, and in this case, the voices of disabled women came out on top. And interestingly, the South Korean government played a very important role in having that happen, as well as disabled women in Europe who were very active.
How do you feel the independent living movement integrates the gender issue?
The independent living movement integrates the gender issue depending on where you are, more or less. In the United States, in the beginning, the independent living movement was very influenced by men. There hadn't been any women in the beginning who were the chairs of the National Council on Independent Living, but then the women got together and pushed so that we elected a woman to be the chair of the National Council on Independent Living. That was in the 80s. So I think it depends on the country. In some countries, women have more of an influence than others. At the end of the day, I believe that it is important that the movement show equality within the movement, not just for men and women, but for other disability groups. And I think in many cases, the independent living movement is still seen as a movement for people with physical disabilities and not seen as a movement that really is broader. I think the independent living movement needs to be a broader movement and needs to really actively integrate people with all different types of disabilities and different ages.